Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amya Kumar Das, associated with the Department of Sociology, Tezpur University. Today in this session, we are going to discuss captive mind, generally as a part of contemporary social theory paper. Today, we will see that how this concept is related to other concepts which are part of this post-colonial scholarship. The phenomenon of the captive mind is best understood in the historical context from where it has emerged. Mostly in the historical context, what we see, colonialism involves a kind of exploitation and domination over indigenous population in the form of economic, political and social aspects. After the Second World War, most of the countries got independent from this colonizing process. But certain things remain with the indigenous population. One among them is captive mind. That is what discussed in this module. So, who is Syed Hussein Alatas? Syed Hussein Alatas describes captive mind as an uncritical acceptance and imitation of Western forms of thought and knowledge by scholars from the non-Western world. Syed Hussein Alatas was a Malaysian sociologist and politician. His academic work focused on the themes of corruption, imperialism, colonialism and post-colonialism, in the context of which he developed the concept of the captive mind. Syed Hussein Alatas was the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Malaya. His most famous work was The Myth of the Lazy Native, which dealt with Western colonial stereotype about the fabled laziness of native Malaysians. He is also well known as one of the founders and an active member of the political party known as the Gerakan. He later left the Gerakan to start another party called the Pekemas, based on broadly similar concern of social justice as the Gerakan. The idea of captive mind in the context of colonization. The expansion of this colonization process started in and around 16th century and it continued till the 20th century. What we have seen during this process, even though the nations and countries got independence on their own struggle, the other forms of domination continuing till now. What happened? Though this kind of colonization and capturing the native mind continued in a subtle way, it was not coercive like this earlier form of colonizations. Even the local, the indigenous population, they tried to please or to convince the colonizers that they are equally good in terms of education, science, culture and civilization. So, it was very suitable and conducive for the colonizers to push their agenda, push their form of knowledge system into the local population. In this context, it started how this phenomena of captive mind, what Alatas talks here, is being created in a more subtle and cleverly way to pursue the local and indigenous population, that without this education, without this kind of science, without the kind of civilizational aspects, cultural aspects, social aspects, this local population or the local culture cannot grow or cannot have progress, cannot have development. In this context, even though this colonization in the physical form was over, it continued through this capturing of mind, what Alatas discusses in his concept called captive mind. While the phenomenon of the captive mind appears among practitioners in all scholarly disciplines, Alatas' focus is on captive minds within the social sciences and humanities. So, if we look at Alatas, he delineates certain characteristics of the captive mind. In his seminal essay, The Captive Mind and Creative Development, he says that a captive mind is the product of higher institutions of learning, either at home or abroad, whose way of thinking is dominated by Western thought in an imitative and uncritical manner. He answered the question, what is a captive mind, by enumerating its characteristics in following lines. It is a product of higher institutions of learning at home or abroad, whose way of thinking imitates and is dominated by Western thought in an uncritical manner. It is uncreative and incapable of raising original problems. Its method of thinking depends on current stereotypes. It is incapable of separating the particular from the universal and consequently fails to adapt the universally valid corpus of knowledge to the particular local situations. It is fragmented in outlook. It is alienated from the major issues of society. It is separated from its own intellectual pursuit. It is unconscious of its own captivity and its conditioning factors. It cannot be studied in a quantitative manner but can be studied through empirical observation. It is the result of Western dominance upon the rest of the world. The hegemony of institutions. It is impossible to call a mind captive mind unless it is systematically conditioned by a structure or by a system. The best way to condition it is to condition the education system, that to higher education system. If we see, we find that many scholars from the non-Western world, they go to the Western countries and receive their education and their training. Similarly, when they come back to their own countries, their mind were conditioned by a certain training, by a certain system. So they start looking and analyzing the local specificities in the kind of training they have received. Another important factor is that if we look at many intellectuals from the Western world, they go to the other countries to investigate, to write about them, and they start a kind of discourse which again is conditioned by their country of origin, the country of origin where they come from. So overall, we see that how this conditioning of their mind, their training, their intellectual system creates a kind of hegemony which is not seen. That is, in this context, Alatas talks about the hegemony of institutions to create a condition where we can call it as captive mind. Alatas discusses about a kind of imitative thinking. He delineates it in the two forms. One is creative, another one is constructive, another one is negative. In his article on the captive mind and creative development, Syed Hussein Alatas clarifies that his quarrel is not with imitation per se, but with the particular uncritical manifestation of it that plagues academia in the non-West. He makes a clear distinction between constructive imitations and negative imitations, and insists that no society can progress purely through its own inventions without adopting and assimilating useful aspects of other societies and cultures. Thus, imitation is not only necessary but also desirable so long as it is constructive. He also speaks of negative imitations as paralleling Dusenberry's demonstration effect, a theory in economics. The main drive in the assimilation of social science knowledge from the West is the belief in its utility and superiority. The assimilation of this knowledge and technique exhibits parallel traits to those of the demonstration effect. They are frequency of contact, weakening or breakdown of previous knowledge or habit, prestige attaching to the new knowledge that it is not necessarily rational and utilitarian. Alatas enumerates the characteristics of healthy creative imitations. These are being based on conscious rational choice, supporting existing sound values, considering problems surrounding the adoption of the innovation in question in a cultural context different from that one in which it originated. Not adopting it would be detrimental to society, deepening the understanding of surrounding phenomena, not disruptive of other more valued aspects of social life, not creating tensions and strains which would undermine the purpose of its own adoption, entering the collective value system and being recognized as valuable by large groups of the population, not being caused by external manipulation. Thus, imitative thinking is a feature of the intellectual enterprise which must be handled with care. While creative imitation is necessary for the progress of human thought, negative imitation is merely a necessary condition for the reproduction of captive minds. Selections of research problem is an important aspect of scholarly thought which reflects the degree of creativity in imitation. Relationship between the universal and the particular. Though there are many knowledge systems originated outside the Western domain, they remain invisible. If we look at this universal and the particular, we can find various examples. One among them is the Arabian sociologist, historian and philosopher Ibn Khaldun. He, around the 14th century, he recorded systematically about the history, about the society, and he started one systematic study and wrote extensively on the particular society with his own conviction without having any kind of influence on his thought. It was developed outside the Western domain. One can call it as autonomous of this Western thought. But he was not taken into account, or he was not used in the scholarly pursuit of many scholars until he was discovered by the Western scholar and given due prominence in terms of his work on history and society of that particular region. While talking about science, autonomy and indigeneity, he says that per se he is not against any kind of scientific knowledge. He has a great respect for scientific knowledge, but while having the captive mind and looking at the scientific knowledge, it might create errors. He doesn't want to politicize the form of knowledge production or to have any kind of politics, to play politics with this form of knowledge. Rather, he is very critical about this captive mind. The concept of captive mind, what he is discussing here, is to look at uncritically and taking ideas from the Western world and using it in the local context. He appeals to various researchers and academicians to use the scientific ideas, the scientific knowledge, but not to hamper it or not to use it in an uncritical manner. So that what he says when he says that science is a form of knowledge which is having in true sense at universal power, and it should be helpful to everybody without any biases. He also talks about this autonomy of this knowledge system, and he distinguishes it from this indigeneity. He says autonomous form of knowledge system can take for issues and things and ideas from other forms of knowledge, but use it in its own context with critical applicability. It is not that to follow other forms of knowledge with a kind of blind eye. Autonomous form of knowledge, they are open to other forms of knowledge, but with criticality, and they use it in the local domain. He also talks about alienation. He says a captive mind is alienated in mostly in the form of two things. One is related to issues, another one is related to intellectual traditions and historical traditions. The major issues means a captive mind cannot look at things which is important in its local context and they cannot pursue it. At the same time, they ignore issues which are most relevant and specific to their particular area. At the same time, he talks about a kind of intellectual and historical tradition. He says that a captive mind will be ignorant with the intellectual tradition the country or a place is having with this the kind of knowledge which were produced earlier, the kind of history it has. So he says that it alienates people, this captive mind alienates people from the major issues and intellectual and historical tradition in its own manner. A captive mind will have, according to Alatas, as a fragmented understanding of the social reality. Because of the lack of consciousness and critical reflexivity, it cannot come out of the captive mind. A person who is with this kind of captivity cannot use its consciousness and reflexivity. Otherwise, that person would have been coming out or would come out of that situation where he or she is under this captivity. He argues that because of this consciousness and reflexivity is not working in its case, and they are completely under the control of the kind of knowledge system where they think that it is the actual, it is the proper form of knowledge system where they can understand their own social reality or social processes happening in their region. But because of this captive mind situation, they have understanding, their understanding is fragmented. They have a fragmented kind of understanding of the social reality and they cannot come out of that captivity. That is what Alatas is arguing in the context of consciousness and how because of lack of the consciousness, they cannot come out of this captivity. So, if we look at this empirical manifestation of captive mind, then it is not possible to quantify it because we may not have that evidence of who is under this captivity and who is not to quantify it. But if you look at in a kind of qualitative manner, you can see the scholarly work of people who are influenced by this Western and colonization process, and if you critically engage yourself with their product, we can find many things which are influenced by the Western thought. What they write in the local context. We can critically realize, we can critically analyze, and we can critically compare this text with the local context and how they have produced that. Thinking what, keeping what in mind, we will be able to understand the process of this captivity, but to quantify it, it is quite impossible to find out that what percentage of this mind are under captivity. He goes further and he talks about captor mind. What is captor mind? People and scholars, those who are not conscious about their captivity, knowingly or unknowingly, when they give training, impart education to others in the similar method, similar fashion, without reinventing the method which is particular and which is free from this colonized form of idea, and that person who imparts education to and to perpetuate the captivity is called captor mind. So in his discussion, this captor mind, what Alatas talks that this captor mind, they are responsible to perpetuate and to spread this whole concept, what he calls is captive mind. Syed Hussein Alatas suggests certain things to counter this captive mind. He says that there is no difference between people who are trained in the Western countries and people who are trained in the native countries because the form of education and the training system is the same. But what can we do to come out of this captivity? He suggests that we should be more reflexive and critical in looking at this theoretical basis, the methods, methodology, theory, philosophy, so on and so forth. While dealing with the local context, while imparting training in the local universities and colleges, we need to be more attentive, we need to be more reflexive, we need to be more critical in dealing with the Western thought, knowledge system, whatever we are using in our local context. So, to conclude this, we can say that this captive mind is a very significant concept and idea which was introduced by Syed Hussein Alatas to understand and analyze the local knowledge system where we are captured by the other form of knowledge system developed in the Western countries. So, in this context, we have seen how after the post-colonialization, even that system and the tradition is being continued in the form of intellectual training and practice. To summarize this whole idea, what we have discussed earlier, I would like to suggest that here we need to see and locate Syed Hussein Alatas' idea of captive mind in relation to other form of concept which were generated in the periphery countries. Suppose if you look at the idea of academic dependency, dependency theory, world system theory, Eurocentrism, so on and so forth, we can find this similarity between all these concepts. So, what to do? How to engage ourselves with this kind of concept? The answer they have provided is that reflexivity and criticality. Uncritical examination of theory and philosophy which were generated in the Western context and applying it in the local context is fatal according to their argument. So, we need to be careful, we need to be reflexive, we need to be more critical to have a more fruitful and engaged academic practices in the developing countries, in the third world countries. So, to achieve that, we need to be more reflexive and critical. For more information, please log on to the EPG Pathshala website where you have more references, reading and other forms of information. Thank you.